Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to Pompeii.
Pompeii.
Yeah. But, we're not just doing the disaster tourism thing.
Right.
We're going to
Correct.
actually look at what daily life was like in Pompeii.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So kind of uncover some of the normal stuff going on there. And we've got like YouTube documentaries, scholarly articles, even a little bit of Wikipedia in the mix here.
Of course. Gotta have Wikipedia.
Yeah, always. But one thing that comes through in a lot of these sources is that this was like a serious city, right? Like this wasn't just some like sleepy little town.
Yeah.
This was a happening place.
It was a Roman city through and through.
Imagine like walking down the street and just the smells hitting you, right? You got bakeries
Yeah.
all over the place. Like I think one of the sources said something like 30 bakeries.
Pompeii Life Before Disaster said they found over 30 bakeries. Yeah.
Over 30 bakeries.
Yeah.
Could you imagine?
That's a lot of bread.
So clearly somebody was eating all those carbs.
Yeah. Carbs were not canceled in ancient Rome. That's for sure.
So you got that, like that would be amazing, just that smell. But then, you've got these thermopolia, which is like kind of like the ancient Roman food truck, right?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Like the ancient Roman fast food joint.
And then, of course, no Roman town would be complete without taverns, which,
Right. Gotta have the taverns.
and of course, where there are taverns, there is often
Illegal gambling.
illegal gambling.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Exactly. So, we're getting this picture, and you said this, like, this is a Roman city. This isn't like some weird outlier. Like, this is a microcosm of Roman life.
Yeah, Pompeii is really a fascinating look into Roman daily life. And it wasn't some anomaly. It was a thriving town. It was a major port city. It was diverse, had a booming economy. And we see that reflected in what they ate, how they socialized, everything.
Yeah. And speaking of that whole kind of like who's doing what, like I think it was in Eternal Pompeii, the documentary. There's this whole bit about this woman Julia Felix.
Oh, yeah, Julia Felix.
And she was like a Roman real estate mogul, basically.
She was like the ultimate businesswoman. She owned this huge property. And get this, she turned part of it into this like super high-end dining experience. But then she also had a more casual, affordable restaurant too.
So she's working all the angles.
Oh, absolutely. Julia Felix was playing the real estate game and winning, basically, catering to different social classes. You've got to diversify your portfolio.
Yeah. Talk about a side hustle. I mean, that's amazing. So, you think about that, like we're talking about like being a woman in Roman society, and often there's this kind of assumption that,
They were stuck at home.
yeah, like they were just, at home with the kids, but
Yeah, but Julia Felix kind of throws that out the window.
completely. She's like, no, I'm going to go be a real estate tycoon. I'm going to run multiple restaurants.
I see, exactly.
That's amazing. So I love this because like already we're starting to kind of like, peel back the layers on what we think we know.
Right, exactly.
And we're finding something much more.
Nuanced, yeah. And, it's just like you said, she had this huge property in Pompeii. Like, imagine being a real estate mogul in Pompeii.
I know, prime real estate.
Right. That's incredible. That takes some serious business acumen.
Talk about location, location, location.
Exactly.
It's wild to think about her just like wheeling and dealing in ancient Pompeii.
Yeah, it really is.
Owning property, running businesses.
It makes you wonder, like, what else don't we know? What other surprises are still buried there?
Right. Like how much of what we think we know is actually true and how much is based on assumptions.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting about these deep dives. There's always something new to discover.
Speaking of discoveries, one of the sources, What Life Was Like in Ancient Pompeii, talks about this really interesting finding about the Pompeian diet,
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
like the skeletons they found.
Yeah, they paint a very different picture than what we might expect.
Yeah, because it turned out that there wasn't this huge difference in nutrition between the wealthy and the less well-off, right?
Exactly. They found surprisingly similar levels of essential nutrients across different social classes.
Which kind of blew my mind because, you always think of ancient societies and you assume there's this massive gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Right, the starving masses and the opulent feasts.
Exactly. But this suggests that maybe, at least in Pompeii, things weren't quite so clear-cut.
Yeah, it challenges our assumptions. Makes you wonder if they had some kind of, like, social safety net or if food prices were regulated in a way that made basic nutrition accessible to most people.
That's a great point. Like, what was the mechanism there?
Yeah.
Because that's not something you typically associate with ancient Rome.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? But it just goes to show you how much we still have to learn about the complexities of their society.
It's like every time we dig a little deeper, we find something that makes us rethink what we thought we knew.
Right. It's like piecing together a giant puzzle.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of challenging assumptions, we kind of have to address the elephant or maybe the erotic fresco in the room. You know what I'm talking about.
Ah, yes. Pompeii and its reputation.
Pompeii's, shall we say, colorful reputation. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of people associate Pompeii with, well...
With brothels and...
yeah, and all that.
And all that, yes.
But the source, I think it was what life was like in ancient Pompeii. Again, they were very clear that, like, this whole idea that Pompeii was just one giant brothel.
It's a bit of an exaggeration, to say the least.
Bit of an exaggeration. It's more complicated than that, like those brothel menus that everyone talks about.
Totally made up.
Totally made up, fake news from ancient Rome. But it is true that Pompeii had a very open attitude towards sexuality.
Yeah, it was definitely more, shall we say, liberal than what we might consider the norm today.
Right.
But it's important to remember that their art and even their graffiti often reflected deeper social norms and power dynamics. It wasn't just about, pure hedonism.
Like with any form of art, right?
Yeah.
It's a reflection of the culture and the times.
Exactly. And in Pompeii, that includes how they viewed sexuality, gender roles, and so on.
It makes you wonder, if our cities were preserved like that, what would people thousands of years from now think about us?
I don't even want to imagine.
Right. Talk about misinterpretations. But anyway, before we get too sidetracked by hypothetical future archaeologists judging our taste in, well, everything,
Right.
we do have to talk about the big event, the reason why we're even talking about Pompeii today.
The eruption.
The eruption of Mount Vesuvius. I mean, we can't talk about Pompeii without talking about that, right?
It's the defining moment, for sure.
And it's interesting because the next Pompeii, that documentary, it does a really good job of kind of like walking through the stages of the eruption.
Yeah, it wasn't just one big bang, it was a process.
It was a process. And at first it seems like a lot of people thought they could just kind of wait it out.
Right, because the initial phase was mainly ash and pumice falling from the sky.
Yeah, like those little volcanic rocks.
Exactly. Scary for sure, but not necessarily deadly if you're inside.
So people were probably like, okay, this is bad, but we can handle it.
Yeah. Probably thought they'd just hunker down, wait it out like a bad storm.
Right, exactly. But then the pyroclastic flows hit. And that's when things got really, really bad.
Yeah. Those were the real killers. Imagine a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and rock rushing down the side of the volcano at like 100 miles an hour.
And over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The next Pompeii had this whole thing about how those flows, they would just instantly incinerate everything in their path.
It's terrifying to even think about.
I know. And it makes those body casts, those plaster casts they made of the spaces left by the bodies.
Oh.
It makes them even more haunting. Because you realize, like, that was it.
That was the moment, frozen in time.
Frozen in time. It's just, it really makes you think,
Yeah.
Like, what would it have been like to be there in that moment? To see that happening?
It's hard to even fathom, isn't it? The sheer terror they must have felt.
And it's not like they had any warning, right? I mean, volcanoes weren't exactly a well-understood phenomenon back then.
No, not at all. They probably had no idea what was coming, at least not until it was too late.
It's a good reminder that we take a lot for granted these days, with all our scientific advancements and early warning systems.
Absolutely. We're incredibly fortunate to live in a time where we can at least try to understand and prepare for these kinds of events.
Speaking of preparation, that's one of the things that struck me about the next Pompeii.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about looking back at what happened. It was about, like, using Pompeii as a lesson for today.
Right, exactly. It's like this cautionary tale reminding us that we're not as invincible as we might think.
Because it could happen again, right? Like, we've got Campi Flegrae, that massive caldera.
Oh, yeah. Campi Flegrae. Now, that's a scary thought.
And the documentary made this really interesting connection between Campi Flegrae and, of all things, Roman concrete.
Right, because the ground beneath the caldera, it's made of this incredibly strong, durable material, similar to what the Romans used.
So I'm thinking, okay, strong ground, that's got to be a good thing, right? But they were saying it could actually make things worse.
Potentially, yeah. Because that strength means the pressure from the magma below, it can build up to incredible levels without being released. It's like, imagine shaking up a bottle of champagne, but the cork is like super glued in. Eventually, something's got to give.
And when it does...
Let's just say it wouldn't be pretty.
Okay, so we're all appropriately terrified of Campi Flegrei now.
Yeah.
But on a slightly less apocalyptic note, I was thinking about something else. We've talked a lot about the physical legacy of Pompeii,
Yeah.
the buildings, the artifacts, all that stuff.
Right.
But what about its, cultural impact? The way Pompeii has kind of seeped into our collective imagination.
That's a really interesting question, and I think it speaks to our fascination with both the grandeur and the fragility of civilization.
Because on the one hand, Pompeii is this amazing testament to what the Romans were capable of.
Absolutely. The engineering, the art, the sheer scale of their cities, Pompeii gives us this tangible connection to that world.
But then on the other hand, it's this stark reminder that even the mightiest empires can be wiped out in an instant.
Exactly. It's a bit humbling, isn't it? No matter how advanced we think we are, nature always has the final say.
It's like this weird mix of awe and terror, we're simultaneously impressed by the Romans and terrified of what happened to them.
And I think that's what makes Pompeii so enduringly fascinating. It's this mirror reflecting both the best and the worst of humanity.
And maybe that's a good place to leave things.
I think so.
With that thought to ponder. So from the streets of ancient Pompeii to the potential eruption of Campi Flegrei, we've covered a lot of ground today. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. We'll see you on the next deep dive.